Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about the real cost of non-compliance. I'm Kimberly Glowacki, and I'm the Director of Strategic Growth here at IP Consulting, and I'm going to be your host today. We're going to walk through why CMMC is a contract eligibility problem and not just an IT problem. But before we dive in, I've got a couple of housekeeping notes. We are expecting this session to run approximately 45 to 60 minutes. Like I said, I'm going to try to get everyone out on time. And then we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So please do drop your questions into the chat at any time. And when we get to the end, we'll tackle as many as we can. And I'm going to introduce here, at the end of our time together, you'll see Milton Moore. He's here. He's our CEO and founder. And he's going to be sharing a little bit about IP Consulting, who we are as an organization. And for Milton, he has spent over the last 20 years helping organizations just like you protect, modernize, support, and most importantly to our conversation today, navigate governance like the CMMC compliance. But before we dive in, I want to introduce our keynote speaker. So Gabe Denny, and he's the finance and operations leader for IP Consulting. But before he joined our team, Gabe retired after 20 years as a major in the U.S. Air Force, where he spent nearly a decade in acquisitions finance, where he worked closely with our nation's critical software programs, our largest nuclear wing, foreign U.S. embassies, special operations, space command, and all under that Department of Defense umbrella. So Gabe's experience was heavily focused on the acquisitions and compliance. And the meaning and the important part of that is that his responsibilities included auditing and approving for compliance before money was ever spent. Gabe, I think you even have bragging rights around your contributions to a couple of appropriations bills. I'll let you get into that if you'd like to. I know you're a great storyteller.
It'd be the weirdest
All of this
flex
to
ever,
say,
but thank you. Okay.
all of this to say, Gabe has lived the real cost of compliance from the inside, and he's here to talk about what it truly costs to get CMMC and what it could cost if you do it wrong. So Gabe, thank you for sharing your career knowledge and all the shifts that you've seen recently.
Yeah, of course, Kim. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the kind words. And yes, that'd be the weirdest thing ever saying. One time I got to write a P in an RDoc, but yes, I did. I never thought that would apply further. But and good afternoon, everyone. Go ahead and hit the slide for me, Stephen. Today, like Kim said, we're going to cover CMMC. Assuming the folks, all of you listening, are at least vaguely aware of the acronym. It cannot be a good Department of War, Department of Defense program without an acronym. Otherwise, it's just not official. So, of course, they threw some letters together. But the biggest thing is, CMMC is nothing more than a framework for ensuring compliance with already existing regulation and law. So it's nothing really new in the sense that the underlying structure of what's required has been there since 2017 and even earlier. But we're going to go over what it is, and then we're going to talk about that announcement last week that came from Secretary Hegseth and the Department of War, what that actually means from a CMMC perspective and from an overall compliance perspective, and what do we all need to do in the defense industry to make sure that we're covering down on what we need to be doing to continue business, not lose it, and secure our nation's interests. So that's what will lead into the cost of non-compliance. We'll talk a little bit about what compliance takes. What does it mean? What are those controls? How does that apply even with the temporary pause that we're going to talk about? And finally, I want to kick it over to Milton, as Kim mentioned, into where navigate compliance actually fits into the picture and how we can help you at IPC. Biggest thing though really is let's talk about this. Let's be informative and get into it. One housekeeping note, a couple of them actually. One, general information, not legal advice, has to be said that. I am a finance person, an operations person, and spent a lot of time in the military. Everyone's situation is unique. Please definitely talk to us with some questions, and anything legal is obviously left best to your attorneys. And the other thing is you're going to hear me probably use Department of War and Department of Defense moderately interchangeably. I worked for the Department of Defense, and it's a hard thing to get out of. But the current nomenclature for the executive branch is Department of War. They are the same thing. And apologies in advance for any confusion there. So let's get into what is CMMC. CMMC is, like I mentioned, is nothing more than the model. This is what verifies that organizations are actually following the underlying NIST standards, the FAR clauses, and other things, and just good hygiene practice for how to maintain a secure network and make sure that DoD information is properly stored and handled. Uh, the duty to be secure, or the requirement behind CMMC, it definitely predates it. It predates even the current NIST standards that came out in 2017. It goes about as far back as computers do. You can trace it all the way back to uh, good old good old NASA days back in 1960s when DARPANet was first set up, and the Texas Instruments is making a link into Wright-Patterson. So data security has been a part of the defense contractor industry since data security could be a thing, and this is just the latest iteration of it. Slide, please. So, as I mentioned, CMMC, as you can see here, is nothing more than validating that you are meeting your contract requirements. CMMC, of course, standing for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, as you can see there. It is setting a framework for how you're measured for handling government information. None of it's new, right? This is just a good framework so that way the Department of Defense and Department of War officials can actually reasonably oversee all of us and how we handle their information. Think of it more instead of having, for those of us who have worked alongside the government a long time, are familiar with the MCA. It's a standardized set of rules that can be followed and repeated, and so that way the underlying law and contract clauses are uniquely applied, or excuse me, are not uniquely applied, but are set up and uniformly established for everyone. It sets a level playing field, which is a net good thing. And like I mentioned, none of it's new. Now, the cost side, the security baseline is a standing cost that, whether or not you realize it, you already had. And CMMC, for a lot of people, and certainly with the outline of the 110 controls related to level 2, is really highlighting to folks some deficiencies in their network environments that need to come out. Slide, please. When we talk about CMMC, you've probably heard these things about levels, and we're going to park here for a minute. And really, where do you hit? Level 1 is kind of the most baseline level. It protects what's called federal contract information. So if you do business with the government, more likely than not, you fit into level 1. There's very rare exception where somebody who does business with the government, it doesn't need to be level 1 certified. It involves 15 pretty common sense practices: limiting information system access, making sure that information is properly disposed of when it's time, making sure media protection is there. Basically the same thing as having a passcode on your iPhone. Lots of basic security practices that apply to make sure that federal contract information is protected. Now, level 2 is the more common, definitely the most common for defense contractors. And that's where you start getting into the CUI handling. Lots of back and forth on this, and frankly, that's what led to the announcement last week. But ultimately, if you handle CUI, then you need to be level 2 CMMC compliant. Again, this isn't something new. The NIST standards existed before CMMC, and the requirements even behind that are long-standing. The difference with level 2 in CMMC was that now you're going to have a third-party assessor come and attest to the fact that you were actually following what you said you were going to follow. Now, CUI is an interesting concept. People get wrapped around the axle about that one a little bit, and I want to disambiguate. Yeah, that's a word I'll use. And go with, so CUI came out a couple years ago and replaced what was called FOUO, or for official use only. It has become a catch-all term for how the DoD handles its information. Now, to put things into perspective, I as a military retiree, if I log into the payroll system, just the homepage for the payroll system is labeled CUI. So the fact that the homepage is there, it is technically CUI. And certainly when I log in, I click past the banner. If I go look at my kids' information for the healthcare, that's CUI. CUI isn't a classification like secret or top secret or anything higher than that. CUI is an umbrella term that categorizes defense information that isn't otherwise for public release or consumption. I can see where people get hung up on that, but the way to think of it as a company would be anything on your intranet, anything on your company SharePoint site that isn't publicly facing, more likely than not, that is similar to the DoD CUI classification. Now, lots of nuance. I'm trying to, it's a soundbite giveaway, but a good framework for those uninitiated to think about is, hey, CUI is that routine Department of Defense data that in any one small chunk is otherwise benign. But when aggregated, can cause some problems. And I'll go over a scenario about that in just a little bit. So if you are a defense contractor or working for a prime or defense prime contractor, more likely than not, you're exposed to this. And so there are some pretty decent controls that need to be in place to make sure we're protecting and safeguarding our nation's information. Now, what paused was this third-party assessment. I'll get to that again in a minute, but it doesn't change the underlying requirement that we got to protect this information. Now, level 3, if you're level 3, you probably already know it. That's called high value CUI. It's not quite classified data, but that one has a government-led assessment. More likely than not, you've already had one of those. If you fall into this bucket, DMCA handled it. But again, CMMC helped standardize how things were being looked at for the underlying requirements that have remained relatively static over the last 10 years. Slide, please. So the next big question, right? Does this apply to you, right? If we're looking at something that sounds like it's expensive, of course, if we've got government acronyms and everything else, people don't see these and think that they're cheap, and you're not necessarily wrong. But what is there for CUI? What's not? What is FCI? Kind of went into the CUI side of things, but again, federal contract information, that's information provided by or generated for government under a contract that isn't intended for public release. So fact that you do business with the government is probably something you put on your website and is publicly available information. If you are on a RDoc or a PDoc, like I mentioned, those are, if you're actually specifically listed in a appropriations bill or authorizations bill, your relationship with the government is otherwise publicly known, and that in and of itself is fine. It's when you start aggregating, okay, well, what is the government buying from you? How frequently are they buying for it? What costs are they paying? That's when you get into that FCI realm. Contract deliverables, correspondence actually with a contracting officer that isn't CUI very well falls into FCI if it's not already CUI. Invoices and reports tied to performance. Also, again, that's at least FCI if it doesn't bump up into that CUI lane. CUI then gets into higher level, and ultimately it's a certification, or excuse me, a standard that the DoD gets to apply. The person who decides what is CUI ultimately is what's called it is called a classification authority. But in general, for the Department of Defense, it's their side determining, hey, this one's CUI. For a host of reasons, you may see inconsistent practices. Each branch of the military has slightly different rules on how they classify things and how they mark things. And so you may be working on a contract with the Air Force and see one marking, and then work on the same, a similar effort, maybe probably different contract vehicle for the Army, and have it marked different. When in doubt, you have to treat it like it is CUI, because ultimately it is the DoD's purview, not ours, to decide what is or isn't that. So if your contract mentions handling, storing, or transmitting government furnished technical data, drawings, or specifications, assume CUI unless a contracting officer is confirmed otherwise. Now I'm going to give a big caveat on that. Unless you're dealing with a civilian contracting officer versus a military contracting officer, both work for the DoD. But if you're dealing with somebody who has an enlisted rank or somebody who has an officer rank and wears a uniform, that person is only there for a short period of time. Their assignment is anywhere from 2 to 5 years. The next contracting officer can come in and maybe apply a different standard. You need to be ready for that and understand that just because your current CO says things are fine, unless it's tied to a specific section of the FAR, things can change. And that's something that we're going to get after in a little bit as well. Even if you're not a government contractor, these standards are still important to follow. As I mentioned with FCI, these 15 controls are otherwise just good practice that likely your cybersecurity liability policy demands you follow as well. If you're in any other kind of regulated industry, these are common sense standards that need to be followed here in 2026 when we talk about frontier AI models being able just to compromise security in new and novel ways. Slide, please. So I talked about, hey, there's some change and CMMC is new and what's going on. Well, where are we? CMMC as a framework and as a set of rules. The rollout started in November of 2025. Now, that's definitely not when the CMMC came into existence. For those of us who've been following it for a long time, we realize the standards in some form or fashion have been kicked around for over 6 years. But in November 2025 was the official kickoff where they established the level 1 and level 2 self-assessments needing to happen. And then what was going to happen this coming November was the requirement for that third-party C3PAO certification, that external audit, if you will, to make sure that you're actually employing the standards that you say you're employing. Self-assessment for level 2 and above was going to stop being enough. Now, when phase 2 happens, that has been delayed. If phase 2 requirements don't change, and you're still going to have that assessment requirement. Now, this is where we start talking about cost a little bit. Roughly 100 or so accredited C3PAOs exist, serving an estimated 118,000 defense contractors who likely need level 2 certification. That is what drove some of the announcement last week. Although it doesn't explicitly state it, I think all of us reasonable people can attribute that fact to the realization that, you know what, the Department of Defense counts on the defense industrial base and the larger contractor community to support it. They can't do it on their own. And the requirement to be ready in November when there's only 100 C3PAOs was something that just wasn't going to be able to happen. Phase 3 and phase 4, I suspect those deadlines will change. We'll find out in a little bit, but ultimately, stricter requirements until it's fully implemented sometime in 2028 was the original plan. Likely will slip a little bit. But again, this doesn't change the fact that the requirements or the framework that CMMC enforces and the steps and the controls that they have, all of those still tie to underlying regulation and law that still need to be followed. You are still right now as a DoD contractor saying you're meeting these standards. You just now, what's paused is having somebody else come and validate. Slide, please. So I've hinted a little bit to an announcement last week. Most of you, I'm sure, saw it or heard about it, that what happened on July 13th, and just want to reemphasize again what changes with it and what doesn't. Slide, please. So I've got the screenshot, if you will, on the announcement there from the Department of War, forging the arsenal of freedom, and it's framed in all the right ways. One, the current administration is trying to streamline the acquisitions process for all. And they acknowledge that some of the CMMC is certainly a heavy cost. Some estimates say as much as $250,000 from start to finish if you have no controls, maybe slightly more. And it acknowledges that the ability to hit things in November was an aggressive target that posed some significant challenges. All the memo actually says is that they're going to review it for the next 60 days and tell us more. So right now, C3PAO has been suspended for November and likely will remain suspended. And they're going to come out with a new timeline and new guidance in the future. I doubt it will be released in 60 days. I think 60 days is what they're going to spend figuring out, okay, well, what's realistic to look at and go forward with while balancing the needs of national security. The fact doesn't change that aggregating this data can pose a real threat to the country. And so it still needs to be secured. All the aggregate data that we put together, all of us, can be used against the folks overseas and our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And none of us want that. So we have to balance, just like in everything else that we see in business and any other regulated industry, balance a real security threat with the very real restrictions and constraints that we face in the resources available to us and personnel time and of course money. CUI protections still remain. So this isn't a get out of jail free card, and this also isn't like a let off the gas moment. So something that I think about is how before I became a finance officer, I had an opportunity to be selected to undergraduate pilot training, so Air Force pilot training. I spent almost my entire second lieutenant time learning how to fly. Turns out I'm too blind to do that. But at the time, I didn't know it. I had a pretty bad flight, and turns out when blind people fly, it doesn't necessarily go well. But we landed, and it was tough. And we got off the runway. We're on the taxiway, and I just breathe a sigh of relief. Thank God it's over and I'm safely on the ground. And as soon as I do that, I'm just on the taxiway, the engine's still running. I feel the IP tap me on the side of the head and definitely scold me on the over the headset, saying, "Hey, we're not done yet. That we still got to get to the parking ramp." And he was completely right to do it. I'm sitting on an activated ejection seat. We're with a turboprop engine spinning and hurtling us toward a bunch of other planes. It's not done yet. The suspension that we're seeing with these 60 days is nothing more than that. We're not parked. This isn't over. And guess what? We're going to go fly again. This is just another turn. So all of us we don't need to take a sigh of relief. This isn't a breather in the sense that, oh, thank goodness it's over. It's more of a, okay, let's get toward the point where we're ready for that C3PAO assessment. Let's get it scheduled and let's continue on the path that we need to be to secure our nation's resources. So the likely near-term savings, again, with the theme of the cost of compliance or non-compliance, is nothing more than delaying cash flow on when you're going to get that C3PO assessor to come out. It doesn't change the underlying requirement to be secure. Go ahead and hit the slide for me there, Stephen. I appreciate it. So let's talk a little bit about law versus administration. So go back to a little bit of a civics lesson. I'm a big geek and big nerd in a lot of ways, and this is one of the many. So let's talk about what's fixed in law first. DFARS 252-204, a safeguard CDI that actually goes back to regulation. It has roots back in NDAAs, NIST SP 800, of course, the protections for CUI and FCI. Those three actually tie back to law. But what's interesting is that they all tie back to either appropriations bills or authorizations act. That is Congress exercising its authority over the executive branch to mandate how the DoD does things. So those three things we need to follow if we're going to participate in the defense industrial base, then we need to follow them, because ultimately the DoD is only allowed to spend their money for people who follow those rules. So it's indirectly applied to all of us. The last one I'm going to get to in a little bit, that one applies to everybody, that False Claims Act. And there's a story that I want to hit through and really hit home on why this matters to everyone. Now, there's some other stuff, though, that's flexible by administration, right? You have the NDAA, you have your individual appropriations bills. You might have heard of a thing called a CR or an omnibus. Those ultimately are funding vehicles and what set the law for the Department of War. Each administration can have a focus area, right? So the CMMC Phase II delay, that is well within the executive branch's purview. And so whether or not, this is an apolitical statement, whoever's in the office can take a look at what their focus area is and adjust within the bounds of the law. Something that I learned with 20 years in the military. I worked for, the Bush administration and the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, and the Biden administration. So learn being apolitical and understanding that, Congress sets some very firm rules, and then each executive has their focus areas that they do. So right now, this administration is focusing on streamlining acquisitions. And I'm sure a lot of people with a lot of the best intentions, just like every administration before them, people with the best intentions. And so with that, they're adjusting things. Now, all of us who don't work on a 2 to 4 or 6 year election cycle need to understand the difference between what are we required to do by law, that left side of the slide, and then what are those things that can adjust over time. The executive can change the DoD to calling it the DOW. Okay, they may decide after 60 days that CMMC is the wrong acronym. They're going to, they change it. I doubt that's going to happen, but they could. It doesn't change what's on that left side of the screen, though. We still have to follow that. So budget to the law, plan to the law, read time based on administration, and understanding that things can be flexible. That security baseline that we have to have is what is permanent. Slide, please. So before I kind of get further into this cost of non-compliance, we've got a couple elements there on the screen. I just want to go through a scenario or a story because I really think it kind of hits things home on that last thing, that False Claims Act. I called that out. Of course, there's all sorts of laws we can throw around, but that last one was the one that applies to everybody, not just to the Department of War. And so let's think about hotels for a second. Now, when I was in we did 20 years in the military. When I was at my retirement ceremony, we did a count, and I spent over 1,300 days TDY. I think the number was 1,348, but it could be off a couple days. Now, that includes 2 deployments, right? So that counts as TDY. TDY means, and I'm sorry, that means you're on business travel, for those who don't know. And a majority of that time was in a hotel. So I stayed at hotels all over the country, and sometimes on base, but often off. And as we've all seen, right? You stay at a Fairfield Inn, you stay at a Comfort Inn, you stay at a Holiday Inn. All of them have inns, I guess. Residence Inn, sure. Uh, all of these places are independently owned and operated. Now they fly under a national flag, a Marriott or an IHG or a Hilton, but many of these are small business owners that have a 200-ish room building, and that's how they contribute to our economy, and that's how they provide for their families. These are small businesses. So I want you to think for a moment now. Let's call it ABC Hotels LLC, and they operate a single property hotel under a national brand. I'm not going to pick on a specific brand. Whatever your favorite is, go with it. If it's Marriott, if it's Hilton, whatever. Now, so they're independent. They've got an owner, they got a general manager, they got front desk staff, they've got some housekeeping folks, and a maintenance guy. They don't have a full-time IT staff. They've got a couple computers with some nationally established booking software ties into their national brand, and the reservation system, and probably a loyalty program. It may be fully integrated, it may not. There's a couple different flavors of that. Now, they signed onto that under a franchise agreement, right? So they're a franchisee, an independent business operating, right? That's all things that people understand. Now, in that agreement is that they've agreed to honor government and per diem rates, something that the GSA sets, and then the DoD is involved in as well in some cases. And ultimately, all these all these national brands have signed on to it in some form or fashion. Now, ABC Hotels never signed up to that. They certainly never talked to a contracting officer. They might not have even realized that they signed up for it. It was probably on page 468 of of 500. And by then, their eyes had kind of glossed over. Um, they never they never thought about, federal contract information or FAR 52204 when they signed on, probably pretty happily, to be to be a Marriott or Hilton or whatever branded hotel. They checked a box, they accepted agreement, and then bookings came in. And they loved it because midweek bookings spiked because turns out they happen to be, close enough to a defense contractor or to some DAU facility or, to some military installation, and that helped. And it helped booking stay that would otherwise be empty. So while they didn't sign up for it directly, they now have federal contract information, and they're now responsible for safeguarding it appropriately. Again, I mentioned those are 15 controls, otherwise benign, probably good things. Now, I also mentioned they don't have an IT staff, right? Independent owned and operated thing. Well, at some point, they find out some marketing platform, some analytics tool kind of recognizes, okay, their personal website, other things, all the stuff that we all look at for marketing for lead generation. They hook up this marketing tool to their ERP. And then, within that then comes in all their bookings, including the DoD bookings and the people's names. Sometimes, and often official travel is tied to their official military address. And so it's john.doe@mil.mil. And so it identifies, hey, this is somebody who works for the DoD. Now, in this marketing tool, right, nobody vetted the vendor, and nobody thought, oh, wow, I'm giving out federal contract information. And they didn't think of where that data is stored, how it's in, it's SaaS, so it's in the cloud, whatever happens. And then all of a sudden, this third-party vendor misconfigures a storage bucket, and now a dashboard link or the entire data is publicly available. Right then and there, that otherwise benign scenario becomes a failure of practice 3 of level 1 of CMMC. Now, this small business that may or may not even be aware they're handling FCI has exposed DoD personnel movement data to the public at large, and they can be subject to a fine 3 times the cost of the contract. So each night or each stay, let's say 100 people stayed for $100. Well, congratulations! Now you have 300 times 100 due. So it's a $30,000 bill that a small business probably can't handle. That's why this is so important to be aware of. So when we talk about the cost of non-compliances, I'm going to get through this. Not being compliant with basic security controls now has some very real teeth. And oh, by the way, that has nothing to do with CMMC. The CMMC, again, like I mentioned, is the model for making sure that we're following these standards in a repeatable, easy to measure way. The requirement to protect that data remains. And ultimately, in this scenario, ABC Hotels, whether or not they realized it, said they were going to handle this data in a way that they didn't. And under the False Claims Act, well, it doesn't matter that there was nefarious intent or not. It doesn't matter if they knew what they were doing. If they don't follow good security practice or somebody on their behalf doesn't, the liability stays, which is pretty interesting. So slide, please. I'm going to keep going through this and try and tie it back to that scenario. I just want everyone to think about that small hotel, that small business, but and understand that anyone who does a transaction with the government meets that same standard. So ultimately, cost 1, lost revenue. This is probably the easiest one to understand and get through, right? If you're not CMMC compliant, or if you don't attest to the fact that you can handle government information appropriately, you're not gonna win a bid. Right now, the one thing I'm going to offer is the requirement that's been suspended on C3PAO certification. Okay, you don't have to do that to win a bid come November. What I will, having sat on the other side of reviewing bids, more likely than not, the person who is level 2 certified and has that C3PAO certification, as time goes on, if the deadline slips, that vendor who has it or is demonstrably very close to it is probably going to win out on a bid versus somebody who doesn't. And certainly somebody who has said, no, we don't have, they're not willing to attest at all, they're not going to get a bid. They're just not going to get the contract. And that doesn't mean, okay, fine, you don't do business directly with XYZ base or with XYZ program office, but if you do it with a prime contractor, if you're working with Raytheon or Boeing or Ball or MITRE or any of those, you still have to follow these things. Your business is in jeopardy if you don't do that. And for many defense contractors, the full industry is, the Department of Defense, it's a significant risk. We got to get after this. Slide 2, next slide, please. So the next cost is kind of what I was talking about with that FCA thing. Legal exposure. False Claims Act turns paperwork into liability. If you say you're going to do this, congratulations, you have to do it. CMMC is what allows you to reasonably state, look, I followed the 110 standards. Great. Follow those. That's important. And you have to, right? If you say you did, and then it turns out you didn't, well, then now the government can collect 3 times the damages based on that false statement. That is actual law. That isn't a regulation that changes with the executive branch. That ties back to this thing happened, and going back to ABC Hotels, now troop movement relative to a deployment related to a unique system that happened to be built by the hotel has been exposed to the public and put people at risk. And that's why it's so important that we do this. Even crazier, right? There's a whistleblower incentive. And so let's say you have, let's say you, for whatever reason, aren't following the things that you said you were going to follow, or a company, I don't want to make it you, of course you wouldn't do this, but let's say a company is doing this, right? And they have a disgruntled employee, or just have a well-meaning employee that discovers it, tries to report it internally, isn't satisfied with the action. Well, there's actually, the employees can file and receive a part of the recovery. So there's a financial incentive for us all to report this because it does still tie back to protecting our nation's resources. The other side of this that's important too on the FCA element, there's a personal and a corporate risk. So the company can be found liable and be fined. The people who signed off, though, this kind of mirrors Dodd-Frank and Sarbanes-Oxley and those financial regulations. The individual who signs off, the CEO, the CIO, or CTO, as appropriate, those people can be personally liable. And depending on how severe, this goes beyond financial penalties and can go into prison time. So that's how serious this is and why it needs, the cost of not being compliant, if you say you are, can be severe and go beyond financial. Slide, please. So 3 and 4, breach impact, delay costs, right? So these things, the quiet costs that add up. Okay, for all reasonable, you put in all controls, you're doing the best you can, and a breach still happens, an incident, if you will. Well, that's going to be expensive. First, you have to fix it, right? You got to figure out what happened, stop the bleeding, and make it right. You still have to report to the DoD. Depending on how things happen, you may or may not be fined in some amount. And the whole time you're doing this, your team or the team that you have working on your behalf is doing something that they weren't otherwise going to be doing. So you have that lost productivity. And then more likely than not, you have some heavy reputational damage that may follow you into the next bid, may impact the option you're exercising. All of those things beyond the normal costs of, cool, I got to remediate this, I got to pay a fine, I've got to solve, and it's important. And then finally, the cost number 4, the cost of waiting, kind of ties into cost of 1, but it's even more. Everything's just going to get more expensive, right? So remediation costs more than a planned program. So let's say you do delay and then you have an incident. Well, now you're reacting on your back foot versus kind of leaning into what things could be. The next thing, of course, C3PAO capacity, likely part of the delay, is tight, right? So the longer you wait to get on a wait list, well, more C3POs are coming online, sure, but not enough or not fast enough to cover the delta. You need to get ready now. Certainly, if you're handling CUI or think you may be in the future, that investment needs to be made. Of course, you've got overtime costs, you've got the assessment window issues, and everything that can come with that can come with waiting. This isn't, again, going back to, it isn't time to breathe and go, oh, thank gosh, I'm on the ground. It's time to realize, okay, time to be ready and get back in the air. Slide, please. So gone over quite a bit as far as what's needed, what the environment is, what's changed, and more importantly, though, what can we all expect, right, from the difference between what's tied into law and then what can change with administration. The CMMC deadline pause, there will be more deadlines that shift or pause, but the underlying requirement to be there, to be ready, and to protect and safeguard information, even for non-DoD contractors, you got to protect your customers' information. These are basic steps that need to be taken to make sure things are secure. Now, the good news is, of course, IPC is really good at this. We have over 20 years experience doing it, and we can get there for you. But as we look at what all is needed, what compliance takes, where does it go, right? We're an RPO and we can help you. So one, your cloud environment, that has to qualify. So when we think about that marketing tool, right, that SaaS marketing plugin that happened to the hotel, well, they need to be compliant, right? So, and this is where a lot of folks miss it and they don't realize, okay, these are all the tools that I'm using to handle my information. Is it ready, right? Standard Microsoft 365 isn't that, in and of itself isn't compliant. Standard Google Workspace or Dropboxes can be a problem. Ordinary email and file shares, all of those things are things that you're going to need to bump up to make sure that they map to the appropriate level of CUI control. This is something that often is found out, can be too late when an assessor asks where their CUI lives. And you don't want to do that. That's where it's important to engage with an RPO early and understand where things are at. And again, pretty common for any regulated environment. Slide, please. And this is, exactly like I said, where we come in, right? We can talk about compliance. We can document those things that will eventually be needed for level 2. And even if they shift words or they shift kind of, okay, well, this control is going to go away or merge into that, the underlying regulatory structure we can help with, right? We can close those common gaps and we can help you decide what is best for your environment and ultimately what will that look like from a time perspective and then ultimately a dollar perspective. And that's all where Navigate Compliance fits in. we turn this daunting checklist, this crazy slew of acronyms and all of these things into something that's manageable because it's something we do all the time, and we have 20 years of experience, not necessarily with CMMC because CMMC isn't 20 years old, but working with regulated industries and making sure that everyone's ready to handle their information appropriately. And with that, slide please. I'll hand it over to Milton to kind of explain further how Navigate Compliance fits and how the 20 years experience that he has can help you and your business make sure you're ready for CMMC.
Thanks, Gabe. That was eye-opening. We've supported regulated organizations for almost 20 years, and we take that job seriously. So we'll move on the slide. So here's your next steps, and it's deliberately low friction. Start with the Navigate Compliance Clarity conversation. It runs about 30 minutes and there's no cost or obligation. We look at where your compliance stands today, identify your framework obligations and gaps, and tell you honestly where you land. No audit, no pitch. Then, if it makes sense, the next step is a clear path compliance assessment, a structured evaluation that gives you a real gap analysis, an initial POAM you can act on. And here's why this matters right now. As Gabe said, even with the rule in the review window, the law is not paused. DFARS, NIST 800-171, False Claim Act exposure are still live. So the pause is not a reason to stop, it's a window. Use it to get audit ready without the deadline panic so that when the rule firms up, reinstatement is a formality. Put simply, know your score before the government does. And remember, a C3PAO issues the certification. What we do is prepare you for it and sustain the program afterwards. So I'll turn it over to you, Kim, for the Q&A.
Thanks, Milton, and thank you, Gabe. I love how you took a chance to be the storyteller and kind of help us understand it through that analogy of the hotel. So thanks for that.
Of course.
All
I'm
right,
invented to storytelling. It's I need a narrative. So.
I like the connectivity of it, but we have been saving some time here for your questions. I know that there's been some private messages that were sent to me through the chat, so thank you guys for that. If you do have a question, please make sure that you drop it in there right now. No question is too basic. We want to make sure that we get your questions answered today while we have Gabe's attention. Gabe, one of the questions that was sent over to me, and I thought this was really interesting, is someone asked, you mentioned that we're an RPO, and they didn't know what that meant.
Yeah, so I think Milton kind of talked to it there at that last slide, right? Where ultimately what it means is that we've met the standards so the DoD has set to set you up and be ready for that C3PAO to come in and certify you. So we're an organization with some folks on staff that are, it's kind of like a certification, or it is a certification rather, that we can help you navigate your CMMC journey.
And that's through the Cyber AB. So the Cyber AB is the accrediting body, so that we've gotten that so we can provide consulting advisory services to those organizations just like yours. So thank you for that. Looks like I have another question here, Gabe. What happens if we're not certified when a contract requires it?
Well, I mean, if you say you were, and the contract requires it, and you're not, it can fall into that False Claims Act area that I mentioned. The most likely scenario is you lose the contract. The government can terminate for cause in that instance if it's discovered and it's severe enough. They can give you time to remediate, and they can fine you, or they can withhold payment. There's lots of things that can happen that generally aren't positive. While each scenario is specific, and each I don't want to overblow anything or say anything too severe. None of the outcomes of that scenario are good or low cost. So if you have told the government you're compliant with something and you're not, that needs to be worked on quickly. It's something that we can help you with, but it's going to be a tough road to go down.
And there's no partial credit, right? So it's not like, oh, so there's this contract and I can get it and then I can make up for it in getting my award of CMMC.
No, because it's really a binary thing, right? You either said you were compliant or you're not. And no, there isn't. Oh, cool, you met 105 of the 110 standards. Those last five will get you. Depend again, each circumstance. There's circumstances. There's all sorts of things, of course. But the short answer is you either are compliant or you're not.
Absolutely. All right, I have another question here. It says, do you know what the breach costs are if we're not compliant? And I'll kind of go back to, I want you to answer it, but for those of you that were asking about that, I think that you spoke to that really clearly about 30 to 35 minutes in as well, but the question came through.
So it short answer is it depends. What's the nature of the breach? What kind of contract vehicle you're in? Um, it can be expensive, right? So, but it all. What's the nature of the incident? Is this something where you're dealing with a virtual machine that maybe had the scenarios are endless. In general, it's going to start in six figures. I don't know that there's too many scenarios where it's less than 10 grand to fix. I'm sure there are some. But if it's an actual incident and it is related to non-compliance, it's not a quick or inexpensive fix.
Thank you
Sorry
for
for the
that, Gabe.
non-answer, other than it's expensive.
Yeah, you don't want to be in
Pricey.
that situation.
Yeah, pricey, more expensive than doing it in the front end.
Yes, absolutely. It's kind of like that whole, changing your oil versus changing your engine. Yeah, oil changes still got more expensive, unfortunately, but engine changes have as well. So
For sure. You'd rather change the oil than the engine any day.
yeah.
All right. So this is a really good question. It says, what's the biggest gap that most contractors miss?
It does go back to those third-party cloud services, right? So it's pretty easy to go, okay, well, this is what's in my environment, but then they quickly forget, hey, we're Microsoft 365, but maybe you're Microsoft 365 business standard, maybe business premium, you're not an E3 or E5, or depending on you don't know what flavor you have, and so now you don't know where your data is stored and if it's truly secure. So that's and that's an easy button one. Now it's okay, well, you're using Salesforce and you're using a third party and somehow that connects to your ERP or accounting system. That'd be another great example. Let's say you use QuickBooks or NetSuite, and congratulations, all your FCI is in there. You're uploading invoices into QuickBooks. Well, those invoices are government invoices with contract data. Is it stored appropriately? That all of those kind of little things can come in, and with all of us, right, we all have a million tools we use, right, and most of them are cloud based.
Yeah.
So those
I wanted to also add with Office 365, what we're typically seeing with our customers are we're moving them into GCC High, which is kind of their government, more secure cloud infrastructure, which is the kind of recommended path there. So again, as Gabe was saying, those are typically the areas that folks don't think about, and they're like, oh, okay, I think we've got everything covered, but have you really looked at your cloud infrastructure? And that's kind of where a gap assessment would help uncover some of those types of issues.
All right, the next question that I have here, it may seem a little bit redundant since we started with the RPO question, but I think it's a really good question to ask, because this is when I struggled very early on in wrapping my head around. But it's, what does IPC do in this whole process that's different than the C3PAO? And I think that we say C3PAO for the alphabet soup, but the Certified Third Party Assessing Organization. But I think that's a really good question. Gabe, you want to take that one?
Sure. And then Milton, I'll let you fill in the gaps, but put the finance lens on, right? Your auditor needs to be impartial and come in and say that you're good or you're not. For the whole purpose of the program is to have a third party, that's the 3P of the C3PAO, come in independently, say, hey, this happened or didn't, and it's supposed to be as objective and untouched, unblemished as possible. So that C3PAO can't be involved in setting you up for success, because then they're biased, right? If nothing else, then that company that's a C3PAO, if they're setting you up to pass that same audit, right? Well, their reputation's at stake if they didn't set you up right. And so the system becomes corrupted, just like
Right.
any financial audit, right? So in the public sector, or if you, depending on, if your business has certain loans and you're privately held, you have to have a third party auditor to come
Exactly.
in and check your CPA, right? It's the same concept. And it's actually something that, it's part of the CPA exam and the finance community has been for quite some time. You need to have that impartial third party. So what we do on the RPO side is get you ready for that independent third party to come in, and then take a look and maybe even help you remediate if needed. But I'll let Milton
Exactly.
explain on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great analogy, is around auditing financials, right? And an outside auditor that's required. And the whole process that you're going through with the audit is show me the proof, right? They'll pull it up and ask, okay, show me how you prove that you've are taking care of this specific control. And you've got to have that available. We have tools that'll help you pull that all together and make it very easy to present to the auditor. We can sit on the call depending on the what our relationship is. And but the idea is that you have to prove these controls, and they're going to spot check that, and you've got to have everything available or show them screenshots and all of those kinds of things. So it is really, they're the ones that certify you. We're the ones that prepare you to go through that process, and then it can assist you to get yourself, if your POAM says, man, we've got to do all these things, I don't have the internal resources to do that, we may be able to help you through that process also.
And I want to kind of piggyback on that a little bit, Milton, because someone from our team, when I was struggling, I was struggling with this concept really early on, and they used an analogy that made sense to me. Was think of the RPO, or our role, as kind of being like, if you've been accused of a crime, right? We're the attorney, so we help you with gathering all the evidence to prove your innocence. We're going in, we know how to demonstrate it, we know what the process looks like. All the things, so that when you get into a courtroom, you don't know the rule of law necessarily. We've all watched a lot of Law and Order, but kind of going through the same process of when I'm standing there in front of an assessor that I'm spending a lot of money on, right? I don't want to fail at that point. I want to make sure that I've been set up for success. So I just
100%.
to me,
That's
that whole
yeah,
the whole law firm thing really kind of helped me out with that. So, gentlemen, this is the end of the questions that I have, and really getting close to the end of our time together. But Gabe, I wanted to give you the final word to kind of wrap us up here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Kim and Milton. Again, everyone for attendance today. The big thing I think that needs to be foot stomped is the delay that came out last week does not mean you need to stop being secure. It does not mean that the cost of compliance has gone down, and certainly doesn't mean that the cost of non-compliance has gone down. The underlying law hasn't changed. You still have to maintain and secure government information, and for good reason. It's easy to get desensitized to it. It's easy to kind of go, oh, this isn't that big a deal. But tie back to the hotel and troop movement, and you realize pretty quickly it's important that we secure this information, because it can turn around and be used against our service members. So with that, everyone, I hope you all have a great day.
Those are
Thank you,
great
Gabe.
points,
Yeah,
Gabe. Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Milton.
no, I was going to say thanks, Gabe. I appreciate the presentation. I think that was good information.
Yeah, we appreciate
Thanks,
you
team.
sharing your expertise today. And I want to thank everyone also who joined us. I hope today gave you some clarity and confidence around the real cost of compliance. Just want to let you know we will be following up with an email with our webinar recording and the details on how you can request your Navigate Compliance Clarity conversation that Milton mentioned a little bit earlier. And again, on behalf of the IP Consulting team, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.